My name is Steve Parker. At what I believe to be the pinnacle of my life, I was in a relationship with an incredible girl named Mia, whom I genuinely thought would become my wife and the mother of my children. Unfortunately, that dream fell apart. Ultimately, she felt too young and uncertain about committing to a serious relationship, desiring instead to explore other avenues in her life. This was a devastating blow for me because Mia and I shared a truly unique bond. She epitomized my ideal partner. However, that sentiment was not reciprocated, which I came to accept. I respected her honesty regarding her feelings. Not long after we parted ways, Mia began seeing a guy named Nick. He was well known to everyone, but unfortunately, he had a notorious reputation. I attempted to caution Mia about him, but she disregarded my warnings, which turned out to be a significant error. Nick Geller was nothing but toxic, and I was certain he would only inflict pain on her. What Mia did not realize was that he would lead her to the edge of disgrace. One night around 11:30 p.m., I found her in a dreadful condition at a gas station near the music festival we had attended together. The last time I saw her was around 8 p.m., with Nick by her side. She appeared hesitant, almost as if she were reluctant to be with him. I felt compelled to intervene, but Nick's violent reputation made me fearful for my safety and hers. Consequently, I chose to refrain from getting involved, a decision I later regretted deeply. As hours passed, despite trying to focus on the music, my mind was consumed with concern for Mia. Why hadn't she returned from wherever Nick had taken her? After not spotting her at the festival for some time, anxiety overwhelmed me, prompting me to leave and search for her despite the risk posed by her aggressive boyfriend. I inquired among festival goers, and eventually a woman informed me that she had seen Nick's car heading towards the gas station. Without hesitation, I rushed there and began searching frantically for Mia. Upon arrival, the car was gone. However, something urged me to continue looking. I made my way to the restroom of the station and was met with a horrifying sight, blood everywhere, and Mia lying unconscious on the floor. In that instant, my heart seemed to stop. A chill coursed through me. My legs felt weak as tears streamed down my face at the thought of losing her forever. Yet then I noticed her chest rising and falling. Although part of me hoped for a miracle, panic surged within me. I dashed over and checked for a pulse on her neck. Thankfully, it was faint, but present, though her condition was dire. Her face bore bruises and was smeared with blood. It was evident that this monster had assaulted her. Her clothes were torn and disheveled, so I removed my jacket and draped it over her to provide some modesty. I found myself in a difficult situation. I had two choices: wait for the paramedics to arrive or transport Mia to a hospital myself. The thought of Mia not surviving while I simply waited was unbearable, so I decided to load her into my car and rushed to the nearest hospital. Upon my arrival, I immediately called her mother, feeling an overwhelming sense of guilt for not having acted sooner to prevent this tragedy. Her mother was devastated and terrified upon learning what had happened to her daughter. She shared my shock and fear, as Mia's condition was critical. I did my best to reassure her, promising that I would handle everything, and then I spoke with the officers who had arrived and requested my statement. At midnight, I recounted the events of that night, explaining how Mia had gone to the party with Nick and how I found her unconscious, bruised, bloodied, and with her clothes torn. I covered her with a jacket before taking her to the hospital. Being a small town, the police were familiar with Nick. They were all taken aback because, although he had always exhibited a volatile temper, no one expected it could escalate to this level. As I spoke with the officers about what transpired that night, Mia's doctor approached me with a grave expression that filled me with dread. He waited until he finished speaking with the officers before delivering the devastating news. "Officers, the patient you brought in tonight has just passed away. We did everything we could, but the trauma to her head and blood loss caused irreversible damage. Unfortunately, there was nothing more we could do. His words felt like a punch to my gut, and tears streamed down my face uncontrollably. I couldn't comprehend it. It felt as if my heart had been pierced. In that moment I realized I had truly lost her forever. Gathering my strength to inform her mother of the tragic news was daunting. Just then I spotted Nick entering the hospital, causing my stomach to twist in knots. He presented himself as if he were shattered by the news, feigning victimhood, which ignited a fire of rage within me. Instinctively, I wanted to confront him physically until he ceased to breathe. Anticipating my reaction, one of the officers grabbed my arm, while another approached Nick for questioning. As I observed from a distance, they moved away from the bustling hospital scene in search of a quieter area to discuss what had happened with Mia after leaving the festival. Nick began his account by stating that he left the festival with Mia around 8 p.m. because she complained of a headache and wanted to go home. "I wanted to stay," he claimed insincerely, "but I agreed to take her because we always support each other." He continued his narrative by claiming that Mia insisted she had something important to share with him and took some pills along with alcohol to calm herself down. He then described how they stopped in an empty parking lot near the festival for drinks. He asserted that Mia had consumed several pills that night, but his account sounded implausible and failed to explain the injuries on Mia's body or how she ended up dead. One officer began suspecting Nick and requested to inspect his car. When Nick hesitated, they informed him that resisting would only raise further suspicion and could make him a prime suspect in a murder investigation. This seemed to unsettle him enough for him to lead them to his vehicle. Upon examining the car's interior, it was clear that it was in disarray. Enough evidence was present to suggest a struggle had occurred there. The officers confronted Nick about this mess. He admitted they had argued that night, but tried to excuse it by claiming it stemmed from an intimate encounter afterward. "What happened is that Mia wanted to tell me she still likes someone named Steve," he said dramatically. "I didn't know how to react because she liked me too." He recounted their argument but claimed everything settled down afterward until she unexpectedly announced she was breaking up with him out of anger. He recalled telling her she needed to stop thinking about me and insisted I wasn't worth it. Listening to his lies filled me with fury. Somehow I managed not to explode despite my hands trembling and my head pounding from rage. Nick's attempts at manipulation were transparent. The officers saw through his deceitful words as they became increasingly incredulous at his story, while Mia would never have the chance to share her side. At that moment, another realization struck me. This tragedy might have been prevented if only I had acted differently earlier on. It became clear that seeking justice for Mia was now my only path toward redemption. Thus I resolved not to remain passive this time around. Meanwhile, Nick continued weaving his web of lies. When she got out of the car, I followed her and begged her to come back inside. But when she told him one of her friends was on their way to pick her up, he claimed he lost control and left. Nick possessed an uncanny ability for deception. His absurd narrative managed to buy him time with law enforcement. After all, couples often have disputes like these, so they didn't take immediate action based on our statements. 3 weeks passed since Mia's death without any significant progress in the investigation due to a lack of witnesses, making it challenging to ascertain whether Nick had murdered her or not. However, one thing remained certain. He was involved in some capacity. Officer Gilmoret interrogated him further, while Nick maintained that their intimate encounter was consensual and merely more intense than usual before Mia exited the car without incident. The police felt compelled to accept his version of events while awaiting autopsy results for clarity on what truly transpired that fateful night. Finally, 3 months later, those results were released. The medical examiner determined that Mia's death resulted from blunt force trauma to her head and additional injuries to her face. Furthermore, evidence of struggle and sexual assault was discovered, leading to a clear conclusion. Not only had she been sexually assaulted, but it was also a brutal homicide. This revelation set the stage for Nick's arrest on charges of murder and sexual assault, with his trial commencing shortly thereafter. The trial opened with testimony from the paramedic who treated Mia upon her arrival at the hospital. He detailed the extensive bruising on her body, recounting every aspect of what he had witnessed. However, this is where things became contentious, and I began to lose my composure. Nick's attorney attempted to undermine the paramedic's credibility, suggesting he was trying to mask hospital errors and arguing that the case relied solely on speculation due to the absence of witnesses. Then, a doctor who had treated Mia claimed her injuries resulted from a drug overdose, asserting that the marks on her body were merely from frantic attempts to revive her that night. I can hardly describe my outrage. It made no sense. I had taken Mia to the hospital, and I knew those bruises were present before she received any treatment. Ultimately, Nick was granted bail, which felt like a gut punch, especially when I saw him exit the courthouse with an arrogant grin. It was as if he had never taken an innocent life, and the entire situation filled me with rage. I couldn't stand to think about how justice was being mocked. Throughout the trial, evidence continued to accumulate, yet it seemed as though the system failed at every turn, creating a torturous experience for both me and Mia's family. It was unfathomable that this monster could evade consequences after so cowardly taking Mia from us. With each passing day, my anger intensified alongside my desire for justice on Mia's behalf. She could not defend herself, and I felt compelled to be her voice, even as the system appeared intent on shielding someone who clearly belonged behind bars. Nick carried himself throughout this ordeal as if he were starring in a soap opera. His victim mentality made my blood boil. He was not just a man on trial, but a monster who had inflicted immense pain and extinguished the life of someone precious. Despite compelling evidence against him, it seemed he might escape accountability. I knew I needed to maintain my composure and not allow my fury to consume me, but it grew increasingly difficult. Mia deserved more than this. I had to ensure Nick faced consequences for what he did. If the court wouldn't deliver justice, then I would take matters into my own hands. I vividly remember rushing up to Nick after his release, filled with rage as I gripped his neck tightly in an attempt to choke him. "You're a fiend, a cowardly murderer. You know you killed Mia and left her there to rot. I swear you will pay for this, one way or another," I shouted in his face, consumed by fury. Yet Nick merely smiled at me without a trace of remorse or guilt for his actions. He shoved me aside and said nonchalantly, "I don't know what you're talking about, buddy," before walking away as if nothing had happened. In the months leading up to the second trial, Mia's parents reached out to me. They expressed their gratitude for my support, but doubted there was much more I could do. Nevertheless, they were resolute in their determination not to let their daughter's murder go unpunished, and neither was I. They decided to conduct their own investigation. Through their efforts, they managed to obtain access to Nick's car and hired a private investigator who meticulously examined every detail from its interior to its angles. This investigation uncovered evidence that aligned almost perfectly with our suspicions about what transpired that night. The second trial took place nearly 2 years later, and thankfully Mia's parents gathered enough evidence to substantiate their claim that Nick had assaulted their daughter and abandoned her at the gas station to die. The trial proved tumultuous with unexpected developments at every turn. Ultimately, however, the judge ruled in favor of the state and Mia's family. Nick received a 50-year prison sentence for aggravated assault, sexual abuse, and murder. While I wish I could say that seeing him led away brought me satisfaction, the truth is he appeared completely unfazed by his fate, as if he simply didn't care. This left me questioning how anyone could possess such a lack of empathy. 5 years have passed since Mia's death. Although I no longer communicate frequently with her family, I check their social media occasionally to ensure they are doing well. Mia often appears in my dreams. I've managed to move forward in life while attempting to put her murder behind me. Yet one haunting thought remains. There are still individuals like Nick in this world. His cold, unfeeling face lingers in my memory. Regardless of who they are or how they appear, nothing is ever truly as it seems. Anyone could harbor darkness as dangerous as Nick's. I've known Luis since he moved in next door. He embodied the archetype of a perfect family you might see in movies. I would often see him with his wife and 2 young daughters running around our neighborhood, filling it with laughter and joy. I always told him that if I ever considered marriage and starting a family of my own, I wanted it to resemble his, an ideal family that brought happiness into our small town. It had been about 4 years since Luis and his family moved to our neighborhood, and we quickly developed a strong friendship, bonded by our mutual love for fishing. Both of us worked as operators at a nearby oil plant, which provided steady employment for many locals. This allowed us to spend a significant amount of time together, both at work and during our leisure activities, further strengthening our connection. I often spent time with Luis's family. They frequently invited me over for dinners and family outings, and everything seemed perfect in their lives. Luis was content with his job, and his wife Carla, who was expecting another child, radiated happiness. However, starting in July of that year, things began to take a turn for the worse. I vividly remember one particular day when Luis invited me on a family fishing trip, as he often did. I eagerly accepted, excited for the outing. Initially, everything felt normal and enjoyable. We woke up early and headed to the lake, just as we always did. Carla would often joke about how we should get more rest instead of fishing at such an early hour. "Isn't it too early for that? The fish aren't going to swim to Mexico overnight." She would laugh, and we would always respond that true fishermen know dawn is the best time to fish. After several hours on the lake, we planned to return home to grill our catch, a tradition we cherished. We were sharing jokes and laughing while the girls ran around on the lawn. But that day felt different. I noticed a look of concern on Carla's face, while Luis remained unusually silent, a stark contrast to his usual demeanor. At one point, as he walked away to check on the fish grilling, Carla took my hand and looked at me earnestly. "Hey, I know you're one of Luis's best friends, so I have something to tell you," she said, with a seriousness I had never seen in her before. "Sure, tell me," I replied, feeling unsettled by her tone. She smiled briefly before asking an unsettling question. "Do you know if there's anything weird going on with Luis? He's been distant lately." The insecurity in her voice made me uncomfortable. I had known Carla for about 6 years and had never seen her like this before. It was clear that something was troubling her, but I hesitated to feed any suspicions she might have. I responded that everything seemed fine between them, even though deep down I sensed there was more going on. That conversation lingered in the air like a shadow over the joy of that day. Carla was one of the kindest people I knew, always smiling and quick with a joke. She was a wonderful mother to her little girls. I never imagined she could be one of those jealous or paranoid wives who constantly suspect their partners of wrongdoing. She was sweet and understanding. Initially, I thought her worries might just be pregnancy hormones affecting her mood. Yet it became evident that she was genuinely concerned. "Look," I said gently, "you don't need to worry so much. Luis is probably just having a rough day. You know how it is?" She looked at me with her big dark eyes and replied earnestly, "Are you sure, Sid? Because I have a feeling something's not right." "Come on, Carla," I reassured her. "We're talking about Luis here. That guy adores you. There's nothing to worry about." My words seemed to ease her mind somewhat, and I felt relieved that I could provide some comfort. I knew Luis well enough to believe he wasn't the type to betray his family. He loved them dearly. At first glance, I thought Carla's concerns were unfounded anxiety rather than anything serious. But in the weeks that followed, it became increasingly apparent that there might be something troubling Carla after all. Luis began exhibiting strange behavior at work. He would mysteriously disappear for hours without explanation upon his return. Whenever I asked him about it, he would offer excuses that made little sense. Additionally, he started coming home late, more often. His car was frequently absent from the driveway when he returned from work. This behavior was out of character for him and raised red flags in my mind. After contemplating the situation for some time, I decided it was necessary to confront him about it. So I planned a visit. One weekend, when Carla was away on a trip and wouldn't return until the next day, seemed like the perfect opportunity to talk with Luis. The next morning when I arrived at work, however, Luis was nowhere to be found, a rather unusual occurrence. Maybe he's just running late, I thought initially, as I waited for him to show up. But as the day dragged on without any sign of him, my concern grew. Just as I was about to head over to his house for a chat, our boss announced it was his birthday and invited everyone to stay for a celebration. Reluctantly agreeing to join in the festivities meant putting my plans on hold, so I stayed behind enjoying beer and cake with my coworkers. The party extended longer than expected. We ended up at the oil storage plant until 2 a.m, drunk and having fun. By the time I decided it was finally time to leave, I'd completely lost track of time. Feeling somewhat tipsy and unsteady on my feet, I made my way toward my car, intending to catch some rest before heading home while trying to sober up a bit. As I approached my vehicle in the dim light of early morning hours, I noticed a truck pulling into the oil facility nearby, not too far from where I'd parked, and despite the darkness surrounding us, something told me it was Luis's truck. I was bewildered as I watched Luis arrive at work at 3 a.m. Something was definitely off, and an unsettling feeling coursed through me, as if my instincts were warning me of impending danger. I felt compelled to find out what was going on. Just as I was about to step out of my car to confront him, I saw him pull a large bundle from the back of his truck. My heart raced, and I froze in place. Deep down, I knew what that bundle was, but I desperately wanted to deny it. It didn't take a keen eye to recognize that it was a body. The horrifying scene left me paralyzed, breath caught in my throat. Initially, I was in shock, unable to process the reality of what I was witnessing. Then, with growing horror, I watched as Luis carelessly tossed the body onto the ground. In the dim light of the night, I could make out that it was Carla, her pregnant form unmistakable. She fell face down, motionless and silent. Panic surged through me as I tried to move closer, but my legs refused to cooperate. The alcohol I'd consumed had left me unsteady and disoriented. Just then, I saw Luis pull his 2 daughters from the van. Desperate to intervene, I struggled to get moving but stumbled to the ground instead. From a distance, I heard the girls' terrified screams as they fought to escape the vehicle. My heart sank when Luis grabbed the smaller one and covered her mouth. My vision blurred from both fear and intoxication, but I could have sworn he was strangling her. The girl's legs flailed helplessly as she fought for breath, but he wouldn't relent. In mere seconds, she went still. Terror gripped me. My mind went blank. It felt like a nightmarish movie playing out before my eyes, a surreal hallucination brought on by too much drinking. Then he turned his attention to his other daughter, and my chest tightened in despair as I witnessed him do the same thing again. It couldn't be happening. How could Luis be killing his family right in front of me? My mind spiraled into chaos. All I could see was him carrying the lifeless bodies of his daughters toward a secluded area between the oil tanks. When he returned, dragging a shovel behind him, everything went dark, the last thing I remember before succumbing to a blackout induced by terror and alcohol. I don't know how long I was out, but when consciousness returned hours later, I found myself lying on the floor. At first I felt groggy with a throbbing headache, but then the horrifying memories of the previous night began flooding back one by one, sending shivers through my body. It had been a dream, a terrible nightmare. nothing more. I repeated this mantra to myself in an attempt to calm down. However, feeling too disoriented to drive home safely, I opted to walk instead. With only a few hours left before work began again, facing the day while haunted by those images felt unbearable. Once home, I collapsed onto my bed and called in sick to work. But every time I closed my eyes in an attempt to sleep, those horrific scenes replayed in my mind. Fearful of encountering Luis outside my home, I convinced myself it had all been a hallucination, a desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of sanity. But soon enough, reality shattered that illusion. In an effort to distract myself from my frantic thoughts and pounding headache, I turned on the TV hoping for some mindless entertainment while taking a painkiller. Instead, what greeted me was breaking news that made my stomach churn violently. Carla and her 2 daughters were reported missing. There on screen was Luis pleading for help in finding his family. At that moment, everything clicked into place. I knew him well enough by now to recognize that he was lying through his teeth. The horrifying truth washed over me. It hadn't been a hallucination. I had witnessed Luis murder his family. But why? Why would he commit such an unspeakable act? My instinct urged me to go directly to the police and tell them everything I'd seen. However, doubt crept in. Would they believe me? After all, I'd been drinking heavily. My testimony might be dismissed as unreliable. It would be my word against Luis's, and he was well liked in our community. The thought of law enforcement siding with him filled me with dread and rendered me powerless. Yet doing nothing felt equally unbearable. Still unsure of how best to act without putting myself at risk if confronted by Luis again left me feeling trapped. After considerable deliberation, and with the painkiller starting to ease my headache, I realized that going to the police was indeed the most sensible course of action if there were any hope for justice. But first, I needed to gather myself because in my current state, no one would take me seriously. The next day arrived with unexpected news. Luis had been arrested overnight after contradicting himself during questioning and failing a polygraph test. The officers grew increasingly suspicious of him until he ultimately confessed to murdering Carla and their 2 daughters. The story quickly became a nationwide sensation, especially after it emerged that Luis had been having an affair, turning our once peaceful neighborhood into something unrecognizable amid such tragedy and betrayal. According to police reports, it was Luis's betrayal that led him to murder his family in order to be with a new girlfriend. During the search of the oil facilities, authorities discovered Carla buried in a shallow grave and the bodies of the girls in crude oil storage tanks. This revelation dealt a devastating blow to both Carla's and Luis's families. In court, Luis pleaded guilty and received 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Since that tragic event, I have spent considerable time grappling with what transpired. The realization that someone I had known for years, who had become one of my closest friends, was actually a cold-blooded killer filled me with dread. Hi, I'm Javier, an ordinary old man with many stories to share. Unlike many of my peers, I have a fondness for horror movies and doubt anything can genuinely frighten me. Don't misunderstand. While some films are indeed terrifying, how can I fear something merely portrayed on a screen? That pales in comparison to what I experienced one fateful day when I encountered one of history's most notorious serial killers. It started as an ordinary day when I woke up for work as a maintenance technician. That morning, I was assigned to check the electrical systems at an old church in a nearby town. It seemed like a straightforward task, and I anticipated returning home for dinner. But I was gravely mistaken. I arrived at the church shortly before noon. The atmosphere was gloomy, with broken windows and a musty odor permeating the air. As I made my way to the basement, where the main switches were located, I heard an odd sound resembling someone shuffling their feet. Initially dismissing it as an animal, I continued on until I reached the basement. There I encountered a tall, thin man in work clothes inspecting something on the floor. My first instinct was to greet him. His face seemed oddly familiar. "Hi, I'm the technician," I said. "Do you work here?" "I've been trying to fix this on my own," he replied with an unsettling smile, hoping to impress the technician who comes in. "I guess I failed," he added casually. "Don't worry about it. It's more complicated than it looks," I responded, trying to maintain my composure. Then he asked something unexpected. "Let me ask you a question. Do you really not know who I am?" "Well, now that you mention it, your face rings a bell. Are you famous or something?" "Oh, yes," he replied ominously. "My name is Dennis Rader." My heart stopped at that moment as recognition dawned on me. It was Dennis Rader, the infamous serial killer known for torturing and murdering multiple victims. Panic surged through me as I tried to act nonchalant despite my growing fear. "Oh, you seem to remember now," he said with a disturbing grin. My mind raced as I froze in place. Unable to think clearly, panic set in, and I dropped my tools before bolting from the basement. With some luck, I managed to escape and reach the basement door, only to find it locked. Desperately banging and kicking at it yielded no results. What if someone had locked it from the other side? Suddenly, everything went black as a loud bang struck my head. When consciousness returned hours later, moonlight filtered through broken walls. The night had fallen. My head throbbed painfully as I realized with horror that I was tied to a metal chair with leather straps. In that moment of clarity, panic set in as I noticed 4 other people bound in the room with me. Fear etched across their faces. A woman wept silently, while an older man muttered faint prayers so quietly they barely reached my ears. Before I could fully assess our surroundings, the door swung open, revealing Dennis Rader again, this time in a butcher's apron and latex gloves, carrying an ominous toolbox, which he placed on an operating table at the center of the room. He regarded us with unsettling calmness, as if this were just another routine task for him. "Hello, my toys," he said cheerfully. "Today is a special day. Please let us go." "We haven't done anything," pleaded the woman desperately. "Exactly what the girl said," Rader replied with a sinister smile. "Today is special because you will learn what real pain is." My heart raced as I struggled to comprehend how I had ended up in this nightmare. I needed to escape. I attempted to wriggle free from the chair, but the straps were too tight. Rader swiftly reached into his toolbox, pulling out a small knife and pressing it against my neck, letting me feel the cold metal against my skin. "You, the one who didn't recognize me, are the first," he said with a chilling grin. With a swift motion, he produced a pair of large pliers and held them in front of me. Terror gripped me, rendering me immobile. I surrendered to helplessness, bracing myself for whatever he intended to do next. "Pain is a powerful tool," he said with a smile. "Today I will show you what real suffering is." And then he began. One by one, he used the pliers to pull out my nails. He was right. The pain was indescribable, the worst suffering I had ever endured. My screams echoed throughout the room, but to Rader, they were music. "Every scream is a great symphony to my ears," he remarked. "Suffering is also an art form." As he continued his gruesome work, his cold gaze shifted to the other captives. "Anyone want to volunteer?" he asked, relishing the spectacle. A man began begging for his life through tears, but that only seemed to amuse Rader further. He pulled a hammer from his toolbox and approached one of the young women whose mouth was covered. She began to cry as she realized what was coming. Without a word, Rader brought down the hammer onto her skull with brutal force, leaving her stunned and blank-faced, as if she couldn't comprehend what had just occurred. I was paralyzed with terror and felt utterly powerless as he continued to strike her again and again until her head was reduced to a mangled mess. Some of us wondered if she might still be alive, though it seemed impossible. This man was truly a monster, an embodiment of evil sent directly from hell. "The sound of bones breaking is one of my favorites," he said with satisfaction. "It's so satisfying." He reveled in his own depravity, proclaiming that he wanted to put on a real show using various tools on all of us. "In fact," he continued, "I brought a knife. But there's something about the hammer that—" He trailed off and turned toward the older man who had been praying fervently. As soon as the old man saw Rader approaching him, he shut his eyes tighter and continued murmuring prayers as if that could somehow save him. There I was, bound and in shock, surrounded by unimaginable horror while enduring pain I never thought possible. All I could do was wait for my fate to unfold, wondering if there was any chance of escaping this nightmare. A knot formed in my stomach as Rader raised the hammer above his head. Just as I braced myself for impact and closed my eyes, I heard the old man's screams erupting into the air. His cries intensified until they abruptly fell silent. Rader turned back toward me, his face splattered with blood. I squeezed my eyes shut again, knowing that whatever came next would hurt immensely. I braced myself for another blow to my head, like those inflicted on the others, but instead he struck my knee with the hammer. The pain was excruciating, a wrenching sensation that felt like my knee had shattered into pieces under the force of the blow. Before I could even process what had happened to one knee, Rader crouched down and swung again at my other knee. My screams reached new heights as agony coursed through me. I thought I could endure no more torture, but instead of continuing his assault, he leaned close and whispered in my ear. "I need you to get out of here and tell everyone what you saw. I'll let you escape and pretend not to see you, but when I'm done with the others, I'll come back for you. I don't know what I'm capable of once there's no one else left." With that chilling declaration, he untied me from the chair. I fell to the floor in desperation and humiliation, crawling toward the exit while listening to the sickening sound of hammer strikes against flesh behind me. When I finally made it outside the church, adrenaline surged through me as I crawled to my car and drove frantically to the nearest house where a family helped me call 911. The operator informed me that help was on its way, but warned it might take some time since I was in a remote area. I tried to stay on the line with her, but soon succumbed to darkness and passed out. I woke up in a hospital room surrounded by police officers questioning me about everything I'd experienced. They informed me that when they arrived at the church, Rader had already fled, leaving behind the bodies of his victims exactly where he had left them. The police didn't apprehend him until 20 years later, in 2005, when he finally confessed to 10 murders, but did not mention any details about those from that day in the church. Although part of me considered reporting him for what happened that day, it felt pointless now. Justice had been served with 10 life sentences handed down to him. But for me personally, it meant little relief or closure. I continue grappling with trauma from that horrific experience. While I'm grateful to be alive, Rader's hammer blows left permanent scars on my knees. Thankfully, I can still walk, though often with crutches or in a wheelchair. But no horror film can compare to what I've endured at his hands. Justice may have punished that monster in prison, but it will never give back what I lost that night. Though he let me go alive, part of me feels like I died along with my sense of safety and security, when home should be a refuge from all dangers. What you think is safe can sometimes turn out to be more dangerous than you ever imagined. This was the case for me in the 1980s when I lived on a farm with my family. My wife and I worked hard to maintain our property, which included a cozy house and a barn for our animals surrounded by a few acres of land. It was a beautiful place, but everything changed tragically one day when something horrific happened to our neighbors. Next door lived Hannah and David, an older couple who had been there long before I bought the farm. They owned their own farm, had a large house, and most importantly, a close-knit family. Their daughter Maria, who was my age, was preparing to get married. They also had a maid named Alicia, who had become part of their family over the years. Having such wonderful neighbors was a blessing. They were always kind and often brought us freshly baked goods while I was building my house. After Maria got married and moved out, her parents remained in their home with Alicia still caring for them. Everything seemed fine. As the years passed, our families grew closer. I got married and had 2 daughters. We often spent time together. However, one night I noticed a strange car parked outside my neighbor's house. It piqued my curiosity since I had never seen it before. Then I saw a little girl, around 5 or 6 years old, step out of the car wearing a black dress, followed by Maria in a matching black dress with a noticeable baby bump. It was evident they were in mourning. Something terrible had happened. Soon after, Hannah and David emerged from their house to embrace their daughter. I later learned that Maria had returned home after losing her husband, which was an incredibly sad time for them all. Yet, despite the tragedy, it was heartwarming to see how they supported each other during such difficult moments. Shortly after this loss, Maria gave birth to her late husband's son, Tommy, and the family began to heal. My daughters grew up alongside Tommy and Maria, and it seemed as though life would return to normal. However, one evening, my wife noticed something unsettling while working in our yard. She saw Alicia walking down the street with 2 large suitcases, looking upset, almost angry and sad at the same time. This was particularly concerning given that Maria and her children had been living with her parents for over 2 years. My wife decided to call out to Alicia. "Hello, Alicia." "Where are you going?" she asked. Alicia approached with a heavy expression and replied, "I'm going home. I won't be working for the Delaware family anymore." My wife froze in disbelief. Alicia had been with them for over 2 decades. She practically raised Maria and was like family to them. My wife tried to understand the situation, but sensed something dark lurking beneath Alicia's words. Concern had already begun to creep into our lives as we realized something was amiss with the Delaware family. Suddenly, everything felt ominous. The joy we once shared with our neighbors faded into an unsettling silence that replaced laughter and shared meals. A shadow now loomed over their farm. "Why are you leaving?" "Is everything all right?" my wife asked Alicia, taken aback by her decision. Alicia's demeanor shifted as she spoke of strange occurrences in the Delaware home. "In recent days I've been seeing things, strange things in the attic," she said with a tremor in her voice. "Every night I hear noises from upstairs." "I know the house is old and creaky," she continued, "but this is different. It's like someone is walking up there and dragging things around." She explained how she tried discussing her fears with David and Hannah, but they dismissed her concerns as mere imagination. Even Maria didn't believe her. "I saw footsteps in the snow leading toward the house," Alicia recounted anxiously. "They were men's footprints, and David hasn't left the house in days." Despite her attempts to warn them again, no one took her seriously. "And last night," she added nervously, "when I went to get some water from the kitchen, I saw a dark figure coming up the stairs." "My instincts tell me I need to leave," she concluded somberly. "It pains me to abandon this family, but something terrible feels imminent, and I can't stay here any longer." With that chilling farewell, Alicia departed, leaving us with an unsettling feeling deep in our stomachs. That evening, my wife and I discussed what transpired. She worried about the Delaware family, but believed they would easily find another maid, given how things were in town. Yet our concern ran deeper because of what Alicia had shared. It was deeply disturbing. Ultimately, we decided not to interfere, but vowed to keep an eye on things. Just as we suspected, within days, they hired a new girl, a young woman at least 10 years younger than Alicia, who quickly adapted to managing their large home. Still, I couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling stemming from my last conversation with Alicia. Then came the worst snowstorm of that winter. We were all trapped indoors for 3 days until it finally cleared up. Life resumed its course across town except at the Delaware household, where an eerie silence now lingered next door as Anna and I returned to work on our farm amidst this unsettling atmosphere. We were surprised that the elderly couple next door hadn't come out to clear the snow, as their yard lay blanketed in white. Even the children, who usually played outside with their mother, didn't venture out, which only heightened our concern. What was happening at the Delaware house? My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check on them. As I approached their home, an awful stench suddenly assaulted my senses, drawing me toward the barn. When I opened the door, what I saw took my breath away. It was the most gruesome sight I had ever encountered. My blood ran cold as I took in the horrific scene. I sprinted back to my house and called the police in a panic. Patrol cars soon flooded our street, but as I waited for them to arrive, reality began to crumble around me. The news that followed would become a national headline. Alicia had been right all along. She had made the right choice to leave when she did. The terror of what had happened hit me like a freight train. I realized that sometimes real danger lurks where you least expect it, even in the place you believed was safest. When I entered that dark, dusty barn behind the house, I froze at the sight of a pile of bodies. They were David, Hannah, Maria, and the new maid. Panic seized me once more as I bolted from the barn, my breath coming in desperate gasps. When the police finally arrived, I learned that the two children had also been murdered. Their bodies lay inside the house. No one could comprehend how such a tragedy had unfolded, or how it had been allowed to happen. Autopsies revealed that all 6 victims had died 3 days prior, just as the snowstorm began. The investigation uncovered something horrifying. The killer or killers had been living in their home unnoticed and likely hiding in the attic before striking. They lured each adult into the barn one by one and then did the same with the children inside the house. The snowstorm had probably prevented any chance of escape. They remained hidden for 3 days, feasting on food from the pantry as if nothing were amiss. It was chilling to realize I had been living so close to a murderer and had unknowingly been the first to discover those bodies. The loss of an entire family at once was devastating, but my wife took it even harder. Each day she awoke to face the house of horrors next door. She felt we had narrowly escaped becoming their next victims, but over time that anguish became unbearable. Weeks later, we made the difficult decision to sell our farm and move away. I couldn't endure another day staring at that house where so much brutality had occurred, especially knowing that the killer remained at large. The thought of potentially becoming his next target was terrifying. Now, over 40 years have passed since that tragic event, and I have not set foot in that town since we left. The image of those bodies piled up in the barn is etched into my memory. I don't think I will ever be able to forget it. Strangely enough, this case became one of history's most intriguing unsolved mysteries. To this day, I am haunted by the knowledge that the monster, or monsters, who destroyed my neighbors' lives in such a horrific manner may still be out there, living freely while those innocent souls remain buried beneath the ground.